the midterm elections in a year and a half are so important. Let me just give you two words why they're important. Subpoena power. If the Democrats control the House, we can control the subpoenas. That means we can do a real investigation and demand documents and have witnesses come and testify. That's why the midterm elections are so important in a year and a half.
Good morning and welcome back to AM Joy. New voter data should set off alarm bells, both for Republicans hoping to hold on to their seats and Democrats looking to take them. A Pew Research analysis finds that the rate of black voter turnout in 2016 fell for the first time in 20 years, while white and Asian turnout increased. And the highly anticipated surge in decisive Latino voting never materialized. The Washington Post concluded that without that shift in turnout, the states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, quote, might have gone not to Trump, but to Clinton, giving Clinton an electoral college victory. None of this happened in a vacuum. As the nation's Ari Berman points out, the 2016 election was the first in 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act, and 14 states had new voting restrictions in effect for the first time. And we can expect more of the same in 2018, because this week, Trump created a commission to investigate, quote, vulnerabilities in the voting system. And Chris Kobach, the guy that Trump put in charge, has a record of restricting voting rights so long that the ACLU has pronounced him the king of voter suppression. And joining me now are Janae Nelson from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Ari Berman, author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America, investigative journalist Greg Palast, Crystal Ball, senior fellow at New Leaders Council, and Robbie Jones, CEO for the Public Religion Research Institute. A mega panel to talk about voting. And I want to sort of bifurcate this, guys, and talk about it in sort of a part A, part B. So part A, I want to talk about this dramatic and historic, really, reduction in African-American turnout in the 2016 presidential election, starting with you, Ari, and then Greg, and then Janae. Was this a matter of reduced interest in voting or voter suppression, in your view?
It was both, Joy. So as you mentioned in your intro, it was the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. 14 states, including some very important swing states, had new restrictions on voting for the first time. I just wrote about a study this week that came out by Priorities USA about Wisconsin. It found that 200,000 votes were suppressed in Wisconsin by that state's voter ID law. Donald Trump only won the state of Wisconsin, remember, by 23,000 votes. That study specifically said that in states with strict voter ID laws, the black vote decreased by up to 5%. And so there were a lot of different reasons why turnout was down. But voter suppression was definitely part of this, and I'm very concerned because now this problem, because Trump has started this new voter fraud, quote-unquote, commission, this problem is going to get worse, and we're not talking about the real problem in American elections, which is voter suppression. The problem isn't that millions of people voted illegally. The problem is that thousands of people tried to vote and weren't able to because of voter suppression laws.
And Greg Palast, you've written very critically and voluminously about Chris Kobach. I want you to talk a little bit about him, but you were also critical of this Washington Post story that talked about the decline in voting by African Americans and the change in African American voting rates by white and African American voters. We can show that chart if we could, that sort of shows which went in which direction. It's kind of hard to read, but white turnout went way up and African American turnout went way down. Talk a little bit about Chris Kobach, the guy who's supposedly going to investigate voter fraud. But in your view, I think you believe that the decline in African American voting was about suppression.
Well, yeah, first of all, putting Chris Kobach in charge of investigating vote theft is like putting Al Capone in charge of investigating the mob. This is the vote suppressor in chief for Donald Trump, Chris Kobach, Secretary of State of Kansas. And one of the key parts, one of the key reasons why Trump is sitting in the Oval Office is that Chris Kobach created a list of 7 million names to remove from the voter rolls. About 1.1 million names were removed from the voter rolls, overwhelmingly minority voters. How did he do this? Remember, Trump said that 3 million people were voting twice. It's not a crazy statement unless you think he's crazy like a fox. That accusation that people were voting twice was actually used to remove 1.1 million voters based on a list of alleged double voters created by this guy, Chris Kobach. He literally had a list of 7 million names that he claimed 3.5 million people potentially voting twice. They didn't arrest anyone, but They removed 1.1 million voters in swing states, including Michigan. I was there in Michigan, talked to the voting officials. They said that of the 500,000 suspected double voters or double registered voters that Kobach gave them, that they aggressively removed tens of thousands. So in other words, I would say that we lost 50,000 voters. Trump's margin was 10,700. And this happened in 30 Republican-controlled states. That's just one of Chris Kobach's tricks, and it's the one trick that may have cost Clinton the White House. So it's not that black voters are too lazy to come out to vote. It's that they are trying to vote, and their names have disappeared from the voter rolls.
And Junaid, you know, Chris Kobach has a long history. Back when he was the Kansas Secretary of State, he initiated 9 different voter fraud investigations, or multiple voter fraud investigations. He claimed there were 1.8 million people registered legally in his own state. This is him talking this week on Fox News about his sort of obsession, which is his allegation that there's massive, massive voter fraud.
Look, voter fraud can affect any jurisdiction, any part of the country, and no, we don't go in with an assumption about what we're going to find. This commission is going in with an open mind. Let's just find what the facts are, find what the numbers are, and put them on the table.
And I misstated that number a little bit. He convicted 9 people of voter fraud when he was in Kansas out of 1.8 million people. Talk a little bit about this sort of issue. Is there a real issue of voter fraud, or is this a myth that exists in the minds of people like Chris Kobach?
It is a myth that has been debunked over and over again, and the numbers that you just cited show precisely what the problem is. When you look at the vast number of eligible voters and active voters and the infinitesimal number of convictions or instances of voter fraud, you see that this entire farce of election integrity is just pretext for a road toward increased voter suppression. And it's incredibly unfortunate that people are trying to lay the blame of this past election, the travesty of this past election, at the feet of African-American voters who have consistently tried to turn out to vote time and time again, and of course were thwarted this election because of the loss of the Voting Rights Act. Many people don't realize that the democracy we've enjoyed for the past 50 years has been supported by this scaffolding of the Voting Rights Act, and that has now been taken away. And we see that states and localities have absolutely run amok. They have instituted strict photo ID laws. They have limited early voting. They have taken eligible voters off the voter rolls and changed polling sites. The list goes on and on in terms of the number of violations, and we've been compiling them on our website, all of the changes that have been unleashed since 2013, since losing Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
And we have a published report from our Thurgood Marshall Institute called Democracy Diminished, which actually chronicles all of the changes that have occurred.
And meanwhile, if this is a push and pull, so we'll put a pin in that for just one moment and come back to it in a bit. But Crystal, if the election sort of had a push and a pull, you had a push of voters that were sort of not allowed to go to the polls, right? Particularly voters of color. But at the same time, there was this pull that Donald Trump exerted on white voters. And if we're talking about myths, you and I talked about this, offline, that one of the other myths is that the poll was only to white working class voters and not to the white middle class. There was a great piece in The Atlantic that talked about cultural anxiety driving white working class voters to go to Trump. But if you also, and they sort of dug into it, fears of cultural displacement, support for deporting undocumented immigrants, aversion to investments in college education, identification with the Republican Party. But what's been left out of that is the middle class white voters that were also pulled toward Donald Trump, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. Cultural anxiety is not exclusive to the white working class. It's not exclusive to poor white people. It also exists very much in the suburbs and was tapped into by Donald Trump. And, it's such a complicated mix. There were some new studies out this week showing sort of the percentage of how impactful that cultural anxiety was versus economic factors. And it's so hard to pull them apart because it is all mixed together. This sentiment that things are changing and we can't control them is also tied into what's the future going to look like for me and for my children and for my grandchildren. But to sort of demonize the white working class and say it's your fault and you're all a bunch of racists and that's why we ended up with Donald Trump, this article and research shows that that's just not the case. So what I think we've got to do, though, focusing as a party moving forward, is we've got to also think about you know, how do we address the real economic pieces, which is something that our party has always stood for, standing by working people in every community of every race and creed and religion. How do we make sure that we're doing that? And then the more complicated piece is, how do we have a better conversation about race? Because as you know, it's too simple to just say there's a bright line here and you're either a racist on this side or you're not on that side. There are people in all of our lives who we know who hold some views that when they come out, we say, well, that's not really okay. But we wouldn't say that they're bad-hearted people or that they're out and out racists. So how do we do that education process to start to pull people back in and really value every citizen in this country?
And with that, I come to Robbie Jones, my favorite statistician. Sorry to all my other statistician friends, because you really sort of live in these numbers. Both your book, The End of White Christian America, which is required reading for everyone, but in this data, which is the data I cited, which is your data, the PRI data, that talked about this sort of sense of cultural displacement among the white working class, the aversion to college investment, the fears of cultural displacement. Are we getting the terminology wrong if we're talking about those voters, those Trump voters, as working class? A lot of these are police officers and firemen and plumbers and people with businesses, college, you know, these are sort of middle class people, right, that are Trump people.
Well, it's a little of both. I mean, what we set out to do in the study is to look at white, non-college educated American voters who were paid by the hour, paid by the job, right? So not middle management. This is the group that we tried to look at, and mostly because there's been a big debate about this. I do want to say from the beginning, this is absolutely right that these cultural anxieties bleed all the way up into the middle class. But we were looking here at the white working class because there's just been a lot of ink spilled about it was all about economic anxiety, and what we found actually is that cultural anxiety, particularly the idea that I sometimes feel like I'm a stranger in my own country, that the U.S. needs protection from foreign influences, and that we need to deport immigrants who are in the country illegally. These factors turned out to be, like, independently, even if we controlled for partisanship and we controlled for income and we controlled for religion and we controlled for all kinds of demographic traits, even controlling for all of these things, these stood up as independent, the most powerful independent predictors of support for Trump. And I think we really wanted to get that out there and certainly it is a both and. There's no doubt about it that the economic anxieties aggravate the cultural anxieties, but the statistical analysis suggests that the economic and the cultural are actually on two separate vectors. They certainly interplay, but the cultural ones are actually more powerful independently of predicting support for Trump.
And to bring us sort of full circle then, Janae, then you wind up with that voter being very supportive of the idea of voter ID, because those same cultural anxieties will lead that voter who is either working class or maybe has a little money, you know, saved in a house, to say, you know what, we should restrict voting, which then actually impacts not only African Americans and Latinos, but in a lot of cases poor whites. So it's sort of a vicious circle.
It really is. I mean, strict voter ID laws affect the elderly, they affect students and young people, they affect, you know, all sorts of marginalized populations, and should be really interrogated by the American public. They are not serving our democracy. We should be moving toward democracy expanding measures like automatic voter registration and other ways to be far more inclusive than we are with these voter ID laws. And I'm not really sure that you can fully decouple cultural and economic anxiety, because part of the culture of thinking of white privilege includes, you know, economic dominance or you know, so I think some of these concerns are really all wrapped up together. And the idea that we're losing something, that this increasingly diverse electorate is a threat to white America writ large, it really needs to be unpacked.
Yeah, and Ari, you know, you write about this a lot because it does feel like these things are so intertwined that anxiety produces support for these kinds of measures. Chris Kobach is going to have support out there for this idea of rooting out fake voter fraud. Where do you see any sort of energy, particularly on the congressional side, to do more to shore up the right to vote? Because it's working for one party right now the way it is.
Well, absolutely, and all of these issues have been intertwined. So the idea that you believe that millions of people are here illegally and you want to deport 11 million people means that then you're saying, well, millions of people are not only here illegally, they're voting illegally. And so they're not just stealing American jobs, they're stealing American votes. So anxiety about immigration then becomes intertwined with anxiety about voter fraud. And it's interesting, whenever Trump is in a pickle, he goes back to voter fraud as his major issue. So when he loses the popular vote, he starts talking about voter fraud, or when we have the largest marches in American history with the women's marches, he starts talking about voter fraud. Then when he's in the middle of firing the FBI director, he's back talking about voter fraud, even though there is no fraud. And I think there's a lot that we could be doing to make it easier to vote. Congress could restore the Voting Rights Act. There's bipartisan legislation right there to do it. In states like Oregon, where they've implemented automatic registration, we've seen very significant increases in registration among voters of color, very significant increases among young voters. So if you look at this data and you say that the black vote is down, the Hispanic vote hasn't moved, young voters aren't turning out at the rate we would like, you have to both counter voter suppression and you have to put in policies that make it easier to vote as well, because when you do that, more people will turn out.
Yeah, and then of course the irony is that the more young voters and people of color vote, the more people become anxious about those voters taking over, and it's a cycle. It's a cycle. It's the reason why we blended this together. This is a great panel. We will have to bring you all back. Janae Nelson, Ari Berman, Greg Palast, Crystal Ball, Robbie Jones. Thank you all for being here. And up next, Trump's war on the media hits a new level. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.